I'm Jeff Korzenik, Chief Investment Strategist at Fifth Third Bank. I'm here to talk to you today about a problem I think every business is feeling to one degree or another, the labor shortage. Today, we're going to share Fifth Third's view on how the labor shortage has developed, why this is such a critical issue, not just for individual businesses, but for the U.S. economy moving forward, and also, critically, a potential solution that could work for the businesses that you advise. Let me start out by talking about the core concepts of economics and why labor force is such a critical ingredient to economic growth. Economists recognize that the economic growth potential of every economy is driven ultimately by two factors and two factors alone. How fast can you grow your workforce, and how fast can you grow the productivity of your workforce? The data you see before you in this chart is from the Congressional Budget Office, the nonpartisan CBO. It details the components of economic growth in past decades in U.S. history, as well as, on the far right-hand side, a projection of future economic growth. In this depiction, the blue area is productivity growth. And as you can see, productivity growth tends to come and go. There's some cyclicality to this, and there are also limits to how much you can drive productivity growth in any given decade. The green shaded area is workforce growth. And as you can see, workforce growth has been declining for decades. And this is the key reason why we have seen lower and lower long-term growth potential in the U.S. economy. In fact, according to the CBO's projection, the decade ahead has growth that's limited to less than 2%. Now, not every year. Years like this year, where we're rebounding from a deep recession, you get faster growth. But over time, we are limited, largely because of our workforce growth, to a GDP growth rate that on average will be less than 2%. Now, that's the macroeconomic economy. Of course, what's macro is also micro, affecting individual businesses. If you can't find enough workers to service your customers, you can't grow your business. You can't even maintain your business. This is a challenge we're being faced with today, and one we at Fifth Third have been looking at for several years. But what we had called the looming labor shortage is now here, and we're going to argue it's here to stay. How did this happen? Well, the pandemic has certainly complicated these matters. We have a key critical concept today at work that economists call reallocation friction. How can it be that we have more than 10 million job openings in the economy and more than 7 million job seekers? Why aren't they finding each other? Well, reallocation friction is a concept that is illustrated by a supply of capital or labor, a demand for capital or labor, but something is preventing them from coming together. In this case, job seekers finding job openings. The pandemic so quickly and radically changed the way consumers behave, how we shop, where we live, how we commute. And all of the sort of things that have changed in the pandemic have changed faster than our workforce can adjust. Let me use a Chicagoland example. We're all familiar with the Magnificent Mile. The northern end of the Magnificent Mile, as most of you know, had a Macy's department store that closed. The city, of course, has tried to get another department store tenant, but has been unsuccessful. There's simply no longer, in this new shop-from-home world, enough demand for another urban department store. So there are many people who have sadly become unemployed, but are now available to work elsewhere. But where are jobs elsewhere? There are places like Joliet, Illinois, where Amazon has a large distribution warehouse. So I ask you, is the person who's worked a department store job for 20 years the same person who's going to go an hour south to work an Amazon warehouse job? Probably not. That's an example of reallocation friction, where the skills, the geography, and the needs of workers differ from those of employers. And this is certainly complicating our labor shortage. This has been made worse in many ways by the extension of unemployment benefits and the augmentation of those benefits. It's not that people are quote-unquote lazy or any of the accusations. It's simply that, given the reallocation friction, workers have to make some very, very difficult decisions to change careers, to move, to get longer commutes, to take a job at lower pay than they left the labor force. When any of us are paid to put off difficult decisions, we'll do so. That's just human nature. But we do think that with the passing of those augmented benefits, we will see some of those tough decisions start to be made. That's already being reflected in some better payroll data, and that will help. But we have other complications. We lost women from the workforce. We lost older workers from the workforce, and some of them appear not to be coming back. In particular, the older workers, this has been a problem on the horizon. It's been estimated that over the next decade, we'll lose 10,000 baby boomers a day to retirement. The pandemic pulled a lot of that forward. Yes, we have the millennial generation, but not much beyond them when we start to face the lack of births several decades ago. And then finally, we have the return of social ills as an impediment to workforce growth. Long-term unemployment, the longer you're unemployed, and many people have been unemployed now for 18 months, going back to the beginning of the pandemic, the more likely workers are to simply leave the workforce, to drop out. Or if they do come back in, it often tends not to stick, or they do come back in, but they come back in at a lower rate of pay, something that harms our consumer-driven economy. The opioid epidemic, a tragedy at many, many levels, is also an economic cost. It's been estimated that something like 10 million Americans are using opioids for non-medicinal purposes. Many are in the labor force, but many are precluded from jobs that require drug testing for workplace safety. And then finally, the subject of our conversation today, the way the criminal justice system has prevented people from reaching their full potential in the labor force, and what we as the business community can do about that. We at Fifth Third do believe that some of the workforce shortage will get better as workers come off the sidelines, face those tough decisions, and come back into the workplace and employment. But make no mistake, the labor shortage is here and is going to persist for decades. Here's the reason why. It's demographics. Demographers use a measurement called the fertility rate. How many children will women on average have in their lifetime? Just to replace your population, you need 2.1 in a developed economy. Mother, father, that's 2, and 0.1 is an adjustment for infant and early mortality. That replacement rate, that 2.1, is shown in the dashed horizontal line. And as you can see, we haven't really been exceeding our replacement rate for decades. Moreover, we're falling to new lows in fertility rates that mean that even immigration can't replace our population fast enough to maintain our workforce. So what's the solution? The solution has to lie into digging deeper into our population to make sure that everyone who wants to work, is willing to work, is able to work, not only can gain employment, but can work to the full extent of their economic capability. Economists have a measurement of workforce participation, the labor force participation rate. It's technically what percentage of your adult, civilian, non-institutionalized population is in the workforce, meaning either actively employed or actively seeking employment. The chart you see before you goes back to 1948. And you can see for decades, the 70s, 80s, and 90s, we enjoyed rising labor force participation rates. It was one of the underpinnings of those kind of 4%, 3% plus rates of growth in GDP we saw year after year, decade after decade. But by 2000, we had peaked out, and we've seen declining labor force participation rates, an impediment to growth, and an impediment to broader prosperity. This is largely a result of the baby boomers starting to leave the workforce and those social ills which have kept people out of the workforce. You can see on the far right-hand side the sharp decline that also was associated with the pandemic. The pandemic has made a bad situation worse. But the answer for the business community ultimately must lie in raising our labor force participation rate, seeking out those who've been marginalized from the labor force to rejoin or to join for the first time. So where do we find them? Well, there are many pools of possibility. At Fifth Third, we think one of the best opportunities is those who have been marginalized by virtue of having a criminal record. Now, there are many measures of this. They're illustrated in the chart you see before you. The measure I like to use is taking a look at the number of Americans who have a felony conviction. It's 19 million, a staggeringly high number of people. Our view at Fifth Third is not all of these can be made successful employees. But when you start with 19 million, surely we can find many millions who can be employed or employed better than they are today. Some of this population is too old to work. Some are employed, but virtually none of them are employed to the full potential of their capabilities because of the barriers associated with having a felony conviction. Saying there's a large pool of potential job applicants available isn't enough. We have to be sure that this is a viable pool of talent. So why this pool? First of all, let's be clear. This is business, not charity. The reason a business should hire someone with a criminal record is because they're the best person for the job, and because that person can add value, business value, to the enterprise. We should also understand that this is not a theoretical exercise. We've studied businesses across Fifth Third's footprint and across the country who have been doing this and have collected years and in some cases decades of experience that we can all learn from. This is not just a path to an employee. This isn't a path, or can be a path, to a highly engaged and loyal employee. When you couple engagement and loyalty, that's a recipe for productivity, which in turn is a recipe for profitability. While this pool is large, it's not unlimited. We do believe there's a first mover advantage. If you, as an employer or the companies that you advise, can look to this pool, perfect these techniques early, you have a first mover advantage. You'll be able to get the cream of the crop that can help that business thrive and beat out its competitors. Now, our focus here is on what it can do for the business. But we at Fifth Third are obviously dedicated to our communities as well. And it's worth recognizing that good business can be good for our communities as well. When we see the employment of people with criminal records, yes, it has to be done to benefit the employer, but it also makes for stronger and safer communities, and we all benefit from that. Again, it's business, not charity. This is a pathway not to an employee of last resort, but to an employee who can add value for the businesses that you advise. Now, you're going to face objections to any consideration of this, and no doubt many of you have your own concerns. We've categorized the objections and concerns of employers into three categories. The first is a combination of liability and safety. Is the business taking on undue risk, either to the safety of workers, to the safety of customers, or to the bottom line of the business? It's important to remember that to be willing to consider an applicant with a criminal record is not the same as saying you have an open door to anyone who wants to apply. The employer gets to control the criteria. The employer keeps control. In our view, this is never about compromising workplace safety. That should never be compromised. It's simply a matter of recognizing that you can hire, with controls and an appropriate process, people who add no risk to your business. After all, many of us have experienced toxic employees who hurt the workplace, who distract management and can cause all sorts of legal and other problems, and yet don't have a criminal record. This is about identifying people who, yes, have made mistakes in the past that have given them a criminal record, but recognizing that these are different people today who can make a contribution. I think it's important to recognize that there is a fact that we should face up to. The reality is that many people, particularly those who are currently incarcerated, were convicted of crimes of violence. But we should equally be cognizant of the fact that being convicted of a violent crime does not mean that that person is a violent person today, or even was necessarily a violent person at the time of the crime. The overwhelming characteristic of people who enter prison is that they are young and poor. And often these are people who've made bad choices, as young people often do, and in bad circumstances, and are not necessarily a reflection of who the person is today. There is, of course, legal liability that could be incurred, negligent hiring liability. This is where the process is the protection. Are you showing that you're doing the right process and being thorough in your background? There's really no escape from this. If you simply discard resumes, there's a real question of whether you're acting appropriately also, not just from a standpoint of needing labor, but also from meeting other legal requirements, like the guidelines from the EEOC for fair consideration of past criminal records. Many people have a prejudice against people with criminal records and assume that they can't be good employees. The track record here is clear. Large-scale studies that have been published, as well as anecdotal evidence that we've collected over the years, all point to the fact that second chance, that is, hiring people with criminal records, second chance doesn't mean second rate. Again, all the studies point to the fact that, done right, second chance employment delivers highly engaged and productive, loyal employees. That's anything but a low-quality employee. Again, why does this work? There's a reason. It's human nature. I think all of us have, at one point or another in our lives, fallen down, made a mistake, done something that makes us less than we would like to be as people of character, and that includes people who made mistakes that resulted in criminal records, pick themselves up and redouble their efforts to prove that they are worth more than their worst mistake. That's what's at play here. The objection does come up. How do we know? Why should we hire? I like to use an argument called reductio ad absurdum, where you take an opposing argument to its logical extremity. So if your view is that people with criminal records can't be a good employee, my response would be, so you're saying that of the 19 million people with felony convictions, not a single one can be a good employee? Obviously, that's an absurdity. The question really becomes, how do we find out who's the right employee and equip them to succeed? The final objections we hear are, in my mind, out of date, and these are reputation risk concerns. In fact, our country and the business community has shifted. There's today an expectation that companies will be involved in solving major problems, whether it's climate change, whether it's questions surrounding poverty, affordable housing. All of these are things that the business community is asked to participate in the solutions. So hiring people with criminal records is so clearly a societal need and so clearly a beneficial activity that the reputation of companies is actually enhanced. And today, more and more companies, including some of the bluest of the blue chip names in corporate America, are publicly focusing on this. I'd invite any of the people viewing this today to take a look at the Second Chance Business Coalition website, and you'll see premier names in the American business community are all committing to trial programs in this and to sharing data. This is a step forward. But it's not just the customers who expect this. It's employees, particularly millennial and Gen Z, Generation Z employees, expect their companies to be engaged in more than just generating profits for shareholders. Again, second chance hiring is a critical component to making a better America, addressing income inequality, lack of economic mobility. This is something that we've seen time and time again across industries, across countries. Younger employees really embrace the fact that their companies are doing this. So I hope we've established that there's a large potential pool of applicants, and there are many businesses with a recorded history of success in tapping this applicant pool and delivering loyal and engaged employees. The question is, how do they do it, and how can the businesses that you advise do this? Let me set up some perspective. Businesses have a collection of good and bad employees. And generally, when you're hiring from traditional employment pools, It looks something like the chart in front of you. A distribution, not exactly a bell curve, but a distribution around an average. Some employees are worse, some are better. We all like to think, like in Lake Wobegon, all our employees are better than average, but the reality is there's a distribution. Even the good employees either retire, some of your most experienced employees retire from businesses, and so you lose some great employees, some are poached away by competitors. And then we're always trying to coach up the weaker employees, but some of them end up parting ways. You have an average in the business community. We're, of course, trying to move that average up over time. That's what a traditional employment pool looks like. Perhaps you or some of the businesses you advise have tried hiring people with criminal record, and it hasn't resulted in the constructive outcomes that I've talked about. It's likely due to the model of employment. We've categorized several different ways of approaching this non-traditional talent pool. The first model is what I call the disposable employee model. And this is sadly one that's very much in play today. If you advise a business that's simply run out of employee possibilities and is desperate, they might be looking at this model, where you approach people with criminal records as employees of last resort, but at least they're cheap. And sometimes that cost of employment, compensation costs, are subsidized by things like the work opportunity tax credit, and that can become the appeal. Well, if you approach this pool of individuals as employees of last resort and don't look for talent, you probably won't find talent. And what this results in is a distribution relative to traditional employment pools that's worse. These companies were neither selective in their approach nor supportive in their engagement with employees. I don't condemn these employees. You do see these models out there. It's better than closing the door to opportunity, but it's not the optimal business model. And I would argue that as the talent shortage persists and the labor markets tighten, this may no longer be a viable model. The other model that many people have had a negative experience with is what I call the undifferentiated model. These are employers that are well-meaning, that do consider applicants with criminal records, but may not fully appreciate the gaps that they need to solve for in order for those employees to thrive. And these employers have told me, I've hired people with criminal records, and I get two results. They're either my worst employees or my best employees. Now, we might think at first blush that the average of best and worst is average, but I think all of us understand the reality is one bad employee undoes the good of multiple good employees. So this model comes about when employers try to be selective, try to give people opportunities, but don't always understand what people from this demographic need to thrive. And many employees may simply not show up someday and not call in, or they may not do well with criticism, or any host of problems can develop. It's well-meaning, but ultimately it's not successful. So what are we talking about? We're talking about the true second chance model. And this is the model that gives a superior distribution, not all perfect by any means, but relative to traditional pools of talent, this tends to deliver very well. What does this model look like? Well, ultimately, it combines two processes. One, a candidate selection, and the other, a candidate support model. Now, looking for people who are a good fit and then giving them the tools to thrive would really work with any pool of applicants. Why does it work so well here? Well, you could apply this pool to, say, graduates of Chicago's MBA program, University of Chicago's MBA program. But those graduates are pretty well picked over. This works so well because people from the demographic of people who have criminal records are overlooked and know they're overlooked. So not only can you find exceptional talent, but you can find that this group is exceptionally grateful and loyal to their employees for the opportunity. What does it look like? The first thing is to keep in mind, yes, this costs money, but we see businesses invest in talent acquisition all the time. We all know McDonald's moved their headquarters from Oak Brook down to the West Loop area. That new building cost them more than $200 million. They did that explicitly in search of the talent, moving to where young executives' potential could be found. We see businesses moving to Austin for tech talent. All around the country, we see businesses making substantial investments. The difference here is the type of investments, and the reality is that you'll have many partners in the nonprofit and government community who will help subsidize that investment. It's an investment, not a cost. What might that look like? Well, in terms of potential partners, these are essentially referral sources for talent. Could be national organizations like Goodwill, has a second chance reentry programs. Could be local organizations like here in Chicagoland, the Safer Foundation or the North Lawndale Employment Network, or any of the dozens of organizations that have really focused on working with people with criminal records, helping them become good and stable employees. You can start with the Chicago Cook Workforce Partnership, which is the local workforce board, which can help be a guide to many of the services that are available that can help provide referrals of people who are good fits for the business's need, and also can be supports for, provide support for the tools those employees need to thrive. And then there's also government working with the Illinois Department of Corrections, working with Cook County jails, or any of the county jails and sheriff's departments. Many of those have reentry programs that can work hand in hand with the business community. Not all nonprofits are alike. You have to work with them, make sure that they are on the same page and really understand the business's need. So for instance, CARA organization, how do they view success? Not in a job placement, but someone staying at a job for a full year. That's a successful CARA graduate. These are important things to consider as you build your partnerships. How is success managed? Do they understand your needs? Can you build a true partnership? But this group of employees does have gaps that need to be solved. And as employers, we're used to solving gaps, but often they're technical skills. This group is often more basic. Many people with criminal records come from backgrounds of deep poverty and have challenges with housing and transportation. Many of them have not had mentorship. If the businesses that you are advising can provide these services, they can build truly great employees. But this has to be done with conscious effort. Second chance hiring is not by accident. It's not just giving someone a chance. It's got to be an intentional process of approaching this talent pool. There are lots of supplemental models out there. Kelly Services, for instance, the national, actually global staffing company, is starting up a second chance transitional employment models where they will provide, or staffing models, where they'll provide staffing and support services and can be a potential way to ultimately make permanent hires. There's groups throughout the country that also provide transitional employment, particularly for people who have very little job readiness. They'll employ them for 3 months or 6 months while training to all sorts of higher level skills. They can be a referral source. There's advanced professional training. There's culinary programs, for instance, for even in prisons and in Cook County Jail for people who are potential restaurant workers. So all of these are potential opportunities to build this into the businesses. Even if a business isn't ready, but is simply interested, there's productive steps they can take. I think the starting point is to recognize, and this is something we call bridging the box. It's important to recognize that there are people with criminal records who are incredibly low-risk hires. People who, yes, may have a criminal record, but have been gainfully employed for years or perhaps even decades. These are just other applicants. They have stable employment, stable housing, all the things that you would expect of a traditional candidate. Why would you discard their application just because of a mistake made long ago? It's also important to look at every candidate in a realistic fashion. Do a true individualized assessment. This is something required by the EEOC, but is not always followed in spirit of that law. Get to know how people can trip up and get a felony conviction. I know, for example, of a young woman, 19 years old, who was out on a date. She was a client of a workforce development program run by a friend of mine, who was charged with a felony because she was caught with 2 fake IDs. And in New York State, post 9/11 as an anti-terrorism measure, if you're caught with 2 fake IDs with intent to defraud, like getting a drink when you're underage, you can be charged with a felony. Now, in this case, that felony was reduced because of my friend's intervention, but many, many people have been convicted of crimes that may not seem nearly as threatening when you get to the details, or you might be able to ascribe to the errors of youth. So know your felony. Become educated on how people actually get felonies, and do that through the job application process. Connect with companies that have been doing this already. Go for proof of concept. There are companies throughout the country that have very, very successful second chance hiring programs and are willing to share their practices with visitors, with visiting businesses. Connect with second chance support organizations. There are many, many in Chicagoland, starting with the Chicago Cook Workforce Partnership would be one place. Go to workforce boards, simply Google the name of your county or town and re-entry and see what happens and who you can talk to. And then, even if you ultimately decide, or the businesses you are advising decide that second chance hiring is not for them, it's important not to stand in the way of businesses that are doing it. For example, very often in the healthcare world, you will see hospital systems who are second chance employers very, very successfully. But there are other hospitals which won't let their vendors, say people doing maintenance on their building or on their equipment, bring into the facility people with criminal records. They stand in the way of second chance hiring. There's no need for this, or in most cases, there's very little need for this, and really should be reviewed whether the companies you advise are standing in the way of other companies that are promoting a strategy that's so beneficial to the community. And then finally, there are people out there, including in Chicagoland, who live in fear every day that a felony conviction from 20 or 30 years ago will come to light and they'll be automatically terminated. People who've contributed to their companies for decades, but live under company rules that require automatic termination of anyone with a felony conviction. That's simply not fair, and something the businesses we advise should consider addressing. There are educational resources out there. Many of them are free. SHRM, the Society of Human Resource Management, offers a certification program called Getting Talent Back to Work. It's a very rigorous program. SHRM, the global leader of trade associations for HR professionals, which makes money through certification programs, so committed to this, they're offering this to free, this certification training for free, including to non-members. Great place to start if you want to start investigating this, asking your HR or talent acquisition professionals to become educated through this program. Dave's Killer Bread, a brand many of us know from grocery stores here in Chicagoland, is a second chance employer and has the Dave's Killer Bread Foundation, which helps promote this. They have a video series that helps train employers on best practices. Something similar from Checker, a background check organization, a national background check organization, has an ebook. And then I urge everyone, just as an exercise, to take 30 seconds, it will take no more, to go to consulting group Level Set's hiring assessment questionnaire. It's 10 questions on the website. I'm not sure I agree with all 10 areas, but it shows you how often we unintentionally set obstacles in our way in hiring talent with unnecessary exclusions. And then finally, people who attended received a copy of my book. If you didn't attend but would like to get a copy, please talk to your Fifth Third relationship manager. We'd be delighted to get this to you. If you want it faster, you can certainly order it from Amazon. That's the QR code, or wherever fine books are sold. Thank you.